So as Neil mentioned, I would like to talk to you today about some of the key aspects of port resilience in crisis. And before I start, I would like to introduce to you the Inter-American Committee on Ports. For those of you who don't know us or would like to know more about what we do, I see many familiar names within the participant list. It's great to see so many friends of the committee, but for those of you who don't know us, the Inter-American Committee on Ports, we bring together the national port authorities of the 35 sovereign nations of the Americas. So all the way North America, Central America, South America, and of course the Caribbean. Our work is mandate-based, and we work under 4 mandates that our member countries have identified. Number 1 being political dialogue. We're the only permanent intergovernmental forum that brings together decision and policymakers in the port industry at the highest governmental level. We have a ministerial process. Every 2 years, we hold our ministerial meeting. Our next meeting, in fact, will take place next May, knock on wood, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so this is one of our mandate, is to really foster this governmental political dialogue in the region. A big chunk of our work, our time, our resources is devoted to capacity building. We have a pretty sound capacity building program. Last year, we granted over 270 scholarships for port officials in the region for targeted technical training, certified courses, in-person, online. We also have a master's program, several master programs, in fact, and we do this in collaboration with our partners and really aim at promoting and improving the management and technical capabilities of the port officials in the Western Hemisphere. As Neil mentioned earlier, we also provide technical assistance on issues that are relevant to our community and upon specific requests. For instance, we've assisted member states with their updating of their port legislation. We have conducted port assessments in the context of port modernization processes. And currently, and this may be interesting also in the context of the symposium, we are developing a green guide for ports, and this guide will be a step-by-step guide onto how to certify your port as a green and environmentally compliant port. This publication will be released in August, hopefully, if all goes well, and I'll be happy to share information on that later. I will leave my contact information at the end of this presentation, so if you have any specific questions to some of the things we do, I'll be happy to. Please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to provide you more information. And another big component, last but definitely not least, if we can go back to that slide one more time, is the private sector collaboration. We work closely with the private sector as we believe that we have to bring all relevant stakeholders in the maritime and port community together. We have to sit at the same table. We have to maybe also have some difficult conversations, but really try to have a holistic approach when it comes to port development, and that, of course, also includes private sector collaboration. Now we can go to the next slide. These are our member countries, the 35 sovereign nations of the Americas. However, through our partnership with PMAC, the Port Management Association of the Caribbean, I saw Glenn is joining us today. We have an MOU with PMAC, and thanks to this wonderful collaboration that we have with our friends from PMAC, we extended our capacity building program for the Caribbean also to those PMAC members that are non-sovereign nations, because it's important that we understand the Caribbean region as a whole and formulate strategies and solutions for needs as such. So we're very grateful that we have this wonderful collaboration with PMAC and really can extend the benefits of the SIP community to those that may not be sovereign nations. Next slide, please. Yes, so these are our 6 priority areas that our member countries have identified, and we group them under so-called tags, technical advisory groups, that each tag is chaired by a member country. And we have different activities and strategic actions that we elaborate and implement under each of these priority areas. And you will see that we try to cover a wide variety of port matters, from port protection to security, sustainable port management and environmental protection, legislation, regulation, logistics, innovation, and competitiveness, tourism, inland ports and waterways, which is specifically important for our member countries in the Southern Cone, and even those, Bolivia and Paraguay, who don't have access to the ocean. And then another important area of ours is social responsibility and gender equality and empowerment of women. We are chaired currently, the committee is chaired by Argentina, and our vice chairs are Antigua and Barbuda and Honduras. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we work closely with the private sector. We have an outfit called Associate Members, and several associate members and strategic partners. We're close to 100 members strong. You will see here organizations such as WMU. Cleo spoke earlier today. We're currently working with WMU, or we're providing our institutional support in their sargassum and environmental management program that they're conducting now in the Eastern Caribbean. We work closely with the IMO, with regional organizations such as SEDIMA, PMAC, the Caribbean Shipping Association. And then we also have partners from around the world. The Busan Port Authority, we have a scholarship program with them for a certified port management training. Our partners in Spain, from the Valencia Port, we have a master's program that we conduct with them. So we really have a wonderful group of partners, and we're very, very grateful for their collaboration. And I would just like to take this moment, because we spoke earlier today in Cleo's presentation about the issue of emissions of vessels in port. So you may see here the logo of a company called RightShip. It's an Australian company, and I wrote this down. We work with RightShip, and we've been working with them for some time on their port incentive program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions of vessels while in port. And this is a program that is at no cost to the port. And RightShip here uses a rating system, and they apply the IMO Energy Efficiency Design Index, and they rate vessels based on their emission index. So they rate the vessels from green to red, and then this information will be made available to the port. And by that, the ports can incentivize those vessels that have less emissions by, for instance, prioritizing their access to the port or reducing tariffs. So this is really a wonderful program. Again, it is at no cost to the port. And if you have any questions regarding this program or would like more information, I'll be happy to provide it to you if you shoot me an email. Okay, next slide. Now we'll get into the topic of this session. And before we do that, I would like to give a little bit of a background to the port environment. As we know, ports are key facilitators of around 90% of world trade. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, maritime transportation accounts for 95% of exports. We know that ports provide substantial employment and industrial activity, and they therefore significantly contribute to national and regional development. And they do that because they integrate all functions of the supply chain and really become, or really are, relevant industrial clusters. Ports have a very unique operating environment. Operations almost always have an international element. Multinational needs and interests must be considered and managed at all times, as well as multiple very complex jurisdictions, for example, when a ship is in port. And despite the multitude of international agreements and codes that must be complied with, there's oftentimes a lack of full transparency in stakeholders. And another component, we've heard this earlier today in the presentation, ports have great sensitivity to environmental changes, significantly climate change. And all of these characteristics that I mentioned, they present a challenge in reality for crisis and disaster risk management, and they must be considered when we develop sound disaster risk management and emergency response plans. We know that building resilience is critical for business continuity and economic sustainability, but also for social prosperity. And the absence of updated measures for disaster prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and relief always result in increased negative influences, not only on our port operations, of course, but on social mechanisms, lives, property, and economic development. And we've seen earlier this year or throughout this year, as the world literally came to a halt in following the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis, that ports around the world and in our region kept moving, providing essential goods such as food, medication, PPE. Neil mentioned it earlier. So how ports respond to and recover from crisis really has wide implications for the societies they operate in. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at some of the regional challenges in the Caribbean context. In the Caribbean, human-made and natural disasters pose a particularly high risk and have a huge negative impact on Caribbean ports, or Caribbean ports. We take a look, for instance, at the Freeport Container Port in the Bahamas. After Hurricane Matthew hit in 2016, it was still only operating at 50 to 55% capacity of pre-Matthew in 2017. And not only in terms of trade is the impact of disasters immense for the region. In the Caribbean, where from every US dollar earned, 80 cents come from tourism, the ability to recover from disruptions in cruise ports, for instance, is fundamental. And while we've experienced an increase in the magnitude of severe weather and hurricanes in the region in the last decade, general disaster risk management procedures remain non-standardized in the Caribbean. However, and I will get back to that a little later, a common regional approach for increased resilience and disaster response is really critical. Another aspect that is mention-worthy is the fact that there are limited resources in a single country, not only financial resources, but also in terms of physical space for storage of supplies and equipment, for instance, or materials. So in many islands, we only have one port that has the capacity, both physically and in terms of human resources, to effectively operate in crisis. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about port resilience. Resilience is this buzzword that we've been hearing for some time now. So what is resilience? Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from disruptions, and resilience is built through comprehensive disaster risk management. Disaster risk management really has to be understood and looked at as a cycle of continuous improvements with the effect of building resilience of ports and the related infrastructure. So that's very important. We really have to look beyond the port installations and also integrate into the disaster risk management cycle those critical related infrastructures. And here you can see this disaster risk management cycle. There's really no beginning and no end. So it is really an effort that is continuous. Some of the key aspects that we can address ahead of time. An important component is the assessment and the prioritizing of risks through a so-called risk registry. When we determine a risk, we should first consider the criticality, or in other words, the importance of our assets. Then we identify the potential threats for each of our assets or installations. And of course, we then have to evaluate the vulnerability or the likelihood of a threat or a negative impact. For example, is the threat imminent versus unlikely? And through assessing and prioritizing risks this way, we can allocate resources and also funds in much more effective ways. The current COVID-19 crisis, for instance, calls for, or is actually an opportunity to reassess our risks and hopefully update our risk registry and our emergency response plans. I'm sure for many of you, this crisis has exposed some of your vulnerabilities in a way that we weren't aware of before. So this is really a time and a moment, in fact, to reevaluate our procedures, to reevaluate our plans that we had in place, and go back and see where we have room for improvement. As I mentioned earlier, given the unique characteristics of the Caribbean region, disaster risk management and planning can't be undertaken as an individualized process. We've seen in many instances that in the event of a disaster, response capabilities are often transferred to a neighboring island where critical resources and capacities are available. And therefore, it's crucial, Cleo mentioned it and highlighted it earlier today, it's really crucial to develop a common response system, a regional common response system, and share critical information amongst each other. And this also means including all participants in the plans and in our training and exercise and drill procedures. And by that, we can establish clear authorities and clear jurisdictions. And just to highlight one more time why resilience really matters. A FEMA study found that 40% of businesses do not reopen after a disaster. Another 25% fail to do so within 1 year. And 90% of businesses fail within 24 months after a disaster. And these numbers are absolutely devastating and alarming when thought of in the port context. Next slide, please. So here are some takeaways. I mentioned earlier the importance of the regional approach for efficient disaster risk management. And this common approach, of course, means building and maintaining relationships. It's critical to know, hopefully on a first name basis, who your counterparts are in the event of a disaster. A disaster or a disruption is not the time to be exchanging business cards. We want to do that pre-event. So we want to identify our stakeholders, identify our partners within the disaster risk management cycle pre-event, and then maintain those relationships post-event. This relationship building, especially in the Caribbean context, of course, goes beyond borders and also includes our colleagues from neighboring island states. So disaster risk management and emergency response planning must follow a regional approach and cannot and should not be executed as an individualized process or thought of as silos. But even when we respond through an efficient, effective stakeholder management, regional stakeholder management, considering the immense challenges that the world is facing in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, who of us here is truly prepared to effectively respond to a disaster, let's say a hurricane in this upcoming hurricane season, while at the same time managing and mitigating a health crisis? I think the answer is probably no one. And that brings us to another critical aspect of port resilience and disaster management, and that is sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability in the context of disaster risk management? It means that we have to develop mechanisms that allow for responses to prolonged interruptions over an extended period of time, which is the scenario we're currently facing in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And this must also include, and this is really important and I can't stress it enough, this must also include mitigating the physical and mental impact that a crisis will have on your staff and your port officials. So we have to train our staff to consider these aspects and of course also include them in our plans. For instance, when a hurricane hits, your team, your staff, you, your stakeholders may experience significant personal losses. Members of your team may lose their homes, may lose a loved one, or experience severe distress. So we have to allow and plan for our staff's needs to take care of personal matters, their family and their own well-being. So our people are key to successful emergency response, and we have to make sure that they're well to execute essential tasks. When we understand disaster risk management as an investment rather than an expense, port resilience can significantly be improved. And this is especially important when we address our leadership for budgeting, for instance. FEMA assessed that for every $1 spent in preparedness, $5 are saved in future losses. And along with investments and financial resources comes, of course, the development and the updating of sound and robust emergency response plans. These plans have to include the responsibilities, capacities and competencies of the various actors within the disaster risk management cycle. And finally, and this is the most important component, all resources in disaster risk management must be aligned with capacity building and training. We can have the most elaborate, complete emergency response plan on paper, but if we do not train our most important asset, which is our human resource, our people, then we won't be successful in our preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. And in this context, I would like to briefly mention a project that the Inter-American Committee on Ports is implementing currently. We started implementation earlier this year. It is a project designed for the Caribbean National Port Authorities, and it aims at increasing disaster risk management capacities in Caribbean ports. It consists of 4 phases. The first phase is a risk and vulnerability assessment, where we evaluate current disaster response plans in the region. Phase 2 is the design of a model emergency response plans for ports. And this model plan it's a template. It's supposed to be a working document that can be adapted to the specific needs of the specific islands and ports, say, be it a cruise port, a multi-purpose port, or a cargo port. So it's really aimed to be a working document that is a lively document that can be adapted to the specific needs. And then phase 3 and 4 is a huge training component. We will conduct regional workshops with our stakeholders, and phase 4 will be drill and exercises where we test the plan and identify any weaknesses that it may have. And we're counting with and grateful to have the institutional support from regional organizations such as SEDIMA, PMAC, the Caribbean Shipping Association, and we're working with our partners and our good friends from the United States Coast Guard on this project, as well as MERS, Hudson Analytics, TNT Salvage, just to name a few. And again, I'll be happy to share any questions respond to any questions regarding this project that you may have. Next slide, please. And before I wrap up, I would like to invite you to visit our website, portalsip.org, where you can find resources, materials, strategic information on the port sector in the region. We have a pretty robust offering of training materials, handbooks, guides, templates that have been made available and developed by many of our partners. In fact, we have an emergency response template that you can download and access that was made available by our partner, the United States Coast Guard. We have a contact database for stakeholder engagement, as well as links that will lead you to other regional organizations and key players in the industry. And what we have done in response to the COVID-19 crisis is we created a site, our team created a site where we gathered and compiled recommendations and COVID-19 responses that our port authorities have implemented. And I invite you to take a look at this material. It is absolutely relevant. And I would also like to thank our member states who have so generously shared with us their measures and responses that they're implementing. And you will see that on the one hand, the responses are aimed at mitigating the negative impact of the virus and mitigating contagion. And at the same time, or on the other hand, you will see that the responses are really geared towards business continuity and really fostering resilience. So with that, this is an open invitation for you to take a look at our site, and hopefully you'll find materials or information that is of relevance to you. And with that, next slide. I would like to thank you again for the kind invitation, Alixum. I'm honored to be here, and I had a chance earlier today when we briefly talked. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to see each other, to stay in touch, to talk about relevant matters, and I'm thrilled and looking forward to your questions and comments.